think the Foreign Service is the front line both of national security and border security. We're out at some 285 locations around the world advancing U.S. national security interests, assisting American citizens in distress, providing passport services, and also providing visa services to those who want to come to the United States to either buy American goods or be tourists in this country and help create jobs for Americans. I run essentially the back room. I and my colleagues provide the support services, security, finance, logistics, facilities, medical, personnel for the State Department and also for some 50 other U.S. government agencies who are engaged in international affairs and use our embassy and consulates as their base of operations. Well, that's always a hard question. You can always do more. There are more things we could do to advance the national security. The total State Department budget is about 1/2 of 1%. In other words, half a penny on a dollar's budget for the entire U.S. government. So one can make the argument easily that if there was more money, we could do more. No, I mean the military budget is 20 or 30 times as large as the State Department's budget. Well, I think this world is changing. We certainly have to continue to do business with Europe. It's NATO, it's the Council of Europe, it's the European Union, so we can't pull out of Europe. That would make no sense given our economic and other relationship with Europe. But other countries in the world are growing. Brazil, India, China, Indonesia, the Philippines. And so the State Department is more and more stretched trying to provide more information, more political and economic reporting and analysis, more consular services, more public diplomacy, more outreach. And as the world grows, as countries rise in importance, the soup keeps getting thinned. I think it really started in the early 80s, where there were attacks on the American embassy in Beirut, for example. But attacks on embassies go back and even into the 70s. There were attacks on our embassies in Pakistan, attacks on our embassy in Cyprus. So the Foreign Service has always had a component of inherent danger, that we can try to mitigate the risks to American diplomats overseas, but we're never going to end that risk. Certainly. There was a new Libya being born following the fall of Gaddafi. There was Tripoli, but there was also an immense amount of new Libya being born in the east, centered around Benghazi. Chris Stevens, who had served in Libya before, knew that there were important issues there. In fact, when Chris first went back to Libya, even before we'd reopened in Tripoli, he went into Benghazi. And so when he became the ambassador based in Tripoli, he knew that there were people he had to talk to, there were events going on, there was analysis that he had to do, and you can only do that analysis by being there. So he chose, rightly, to visit Benghazi. We had a small installation there. We had been in a hotel once, but there were bombings at that hotel, and so we moved to a compound with setback, i.e. distance from the road, distance from where the bombs could go off. We fortified that. We spent hundreds of thousands of dollars increasing the security at that compound, but there are always events that you cannot foresee. You can project. There had been incidents in Benghazi, small arms attacks, a few rocket-propelled grenades, but there had been nothing until that tragic evening of the nature of a massed armed attack by dozens of individuals on any compound, on any entity. And so we were there, a number of other governments were there, the Italians were there, the United Nations were there, the British had been in Benghazi that day surveying so they because they were thinking about coming back. So he had made all the logical preparations. But you can mitigate risk, but you cannot end it. It's like doing an equation, but you can't get exact numbers. Think of it as an equation with risk and reward. The reward is the information, the influence, the projection of U.S. national interests that we can obtain by being in a location, working with the people there of all walks of life. So that's the reward to the American people, our advancing their national security. And then there are the risks, terrorist groups, disease, whatever they might be. And so you try to come up with an analysis of, here's the reward, this is what we're going to get, here are the risks. You then mitigate the risk, and then you just watch the equation. As the ability to act in that country, to move around, drops and the risks rise, you get to a point where it's time to leave. And a good example of that might be Damascus several years ago when Robert Ford was the ambassador there. Robert Ford was doing an incredible job representing the U.S. in Syria, but as the tensions rose there, as he was more and more constrained by the government from getting out and doing the job a diplomat had to do, the reward that we could obtain, the work that he could do was dropping, and the risk rose. And at that point, the Secretary made the decision that it was time to close the American embassy. Usually the term non-state actors refers to some kind of a terrorist organization. Terrorist cells are often small. It is therefore difficult for us to track them, to know what they're doing. It's often difficult for the host nation to track them and to provide the kind of security that they're responsible for under the Vienna Convention. The result is that they can be very, very deadly. At the same time, if there are important U.S. national interests to advance in a country, we're going to be in that country. We're going to do our job. While we're doing our job, we look at the risk. We work with the host nation, we work with other U.S. government agencies, and we just continue to monitor it. Is the work we're doing contributing sufficiently to the U.S. national interests to outweigh the risk? And then how much can we mitigate that risk? How much can we construct facilities? How much could we add a bulletproof car? How much can we add diplomatic security professionals, et cetera? And so that's the equation. And you keep working at that equation, you're working at it. At some point, you could have, such as we had in Syria a number of years ago. Our ambassador there was doing an incredible job advancing the U.S. national interests, but as his work was more and more constrained by the government of Syria, and the civil war kept expanding there, it reached the point where his ability to advance the U.S. national interest was so constrained and the risk had risen so high, at that point you close the installation and leave. Well, I think what he was saying is, unlike the U.S. military that has bases, air bases, or the military has a hugely larger budget than the State Department, and they buy aircraft, they buy tanks. So there are in almost every part of every state in the Union some direct affiliation with the United States military. The State Department does have offices around this country. We're the ones who provide the American citizens with the passports they need to go. So we have, a couple of dozen passport agencies around this country to provide services to American people. But it is dwarfed by the military presence. What we do is essentially provide information, political analysis, economic analysis, consular services to Americans who travel abroad, support services for other agencies. But the image of those services is not as upfront as what an American citizen sees when he sees a neighbor who works at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. I'm in fact, the chief management officer of the department. My responsibilities are to ensure that we recruit, we train personnel for the missions they must undertake. We provide them with the security that they need and other government agencies need abroad, manage the finances, the budget, the fiscal responsibilities of the department, the medical care that we have to provide in many locations because there's not adequate medical care, logistics, transportation, facilities. When you talk about an American embassy, you're not only talking about the people who are there, you're talking about a building which has to house offices, house consular sections, house communications areas. So it is the infrastructure, the platform on which diplomacy is carried out abroad. I think the challenges are that we live in a very, very swiftly changing world. The world continues to grow. There are more demands on the Foreign Service, more demand for political reporting. For example, when you were in a bipolar world in the 60s or 70s and 80s, you had the US and the Soviet Union. And in most countries, you had oligarchs of some kind or another. And so if you wanted to know information about Xanadu, there was a small number of actors in that country who you could communicate with, and you had a knowledge of what Xanadu's views of the United States are, where Xanadu is going in the world. A lot simpler. Now, wonderfully, you have democracies in many more locations. And when you have democracies, there's many more actors. There's the business community. There's non-governmental organizations. There's the academic community. There are provincial or municipal governments that are a lot more powerful than they were under oligarchs. And so our ability to advance the U.S. national interest, to understand what's going on in a given country, requires a lot more exchange with a lot more people. That's more time consuming, and therefore the strain on doing all that additional labor is sapping our ability, I believe, to do the best job we possibly can because we're simply strained. Well, I think there are two. One, as I think a lot of people in America believe that the State Department is some huge government agency that spends billions and billions and billions of dollars for no benefit to the American people. I think if the most American people realize that our budget at the State Department is 1/2 of 1%, in other words, 1/2 of a penny on every dollar that the government expended, I think they might realize the value that they're getting for that 1/2 a penny. Secondly, I think that they don't really see that benefit. If they, for example, worked for a major U.S. manufacturer, and that company wants to sell abroad, that company might go to the Export-Import Bank to get a loan or a loan guarantee in order to sell their product overseas. Where does the Export-Import Bank get the information in order to do their business? They get it from State Department economic officers overseas who are doing the economic analysis of that country's ability to pay their bills. And therefore we are creating jobs. According to the Department of Commerce, for every visa, every 62 visas that our consular officers issue overseas, there's a job created in the United States in the travel and tourism industry. So we're a major player in national security. We're a major player in the economic security of the United States.